Good afternoon. Is it afternoon yet? Ish. Thank you so much to all the organizers, everyone behind the scenes who got us into this space, and to my wonderful colleague, Alicia Bunton, for reading the book and coming up with some amazing questions that we'll dive into in just a moment. But I thought I would start with a little primer just to give you a sense of the motivations, the backstory of this book, let's say. About 15 years ago, when I first started my first professor job, I was trying to learn everything I could about teaching because somehow they don't teach you how to teach in grad school. I came across a famous study conducted by NASA that was focused on creativity. The researchers were interested in measuring the capacity for what they called divergent thinking. That is, the ability to see beyond what's right in front of us and come up with many different ways of thinking through a problem. So what they did was followed a cohort of 1,600 children over many years, a longitudinal analysis, giving them a creativity test that was initially designed for NASA recruits. And the results were shocking, in that almost 100% of 5-year-olds fell into the genius level category for divergent thinking. More shocking still was that each year the percentage dropped until only 12% of 15-year-olds and 2% of adults exhibited this creative capacity. In other words, this inherent genius that we all possess is schooled out of us. The very place we should be able to go to incite our imagination is the place where it's routinely squashed, ground down, standardized. Not inevitably, but predictably. And it's not just individual students who suffer, but society as a whole. So what if we took imagination seriously, not as a flight of fancy or something reserved only for self-proclaimed artistes, but imagination as a resource, a capacity, a muscle? How might the power of our collective imagination begin to transform the world around us? So to explore these questions, let's do a little exercise, activity. Splitting the room in half. It's so easy here because we have this nice middle way. So that side, your catchphrase when I point to you is "be bold." And I want you to say it like you're trying to shoot me like a rocket into the sky. All right, ready? Be bold. Okay. This side, your catchphrase is "get real." And I want you to say it like an angsty teenager, like you're trying to ground me into the ground. Okay, ready? Get real. Okay, let's try it again. Be bold. Get real. Space travel. Be bold. Free public transportation. Colonize Mars, decolonize Earth, AI superintelligence, cancel student debt, build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse, build affordable housing for all, spend billions on weapons and war, stop the genocide, ceasefire now. You get the picture. Boldness is rationed, while realism is mass-produced. We are in many ways trapped inside the lopsided imagination of those who monopolize power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. These futurists, they let their own imaginations run wild when it comes to transforming our digital and physical realities. But their visions grow limp when it comes to transforming our social reality so that everyone can live a good and meaningful life. With that in mind, I want to share just a couple experiences that I've been thinking about imagination in various forms and the relationship between innovation and inequity. And I want to just give you a few touchstones before we jump into the conversation. Before I do, I should say that I come from many Souths. I was born in southern India, raised equal parts in South Central Los Angeles and South Carolina. I spent my youth in the South Pacific, and went to high school in Southern Africa, and then went to college in Southwest Atlanta. So I bring this perspective of looking at the world from its underbelly to all of my work. So I'm 15 years old, my family's packing up house in Conway, South Carolina, moving to the Marshall Islands for my parents' work. And we're initially land on Majuro, the capital island, and soon I make friends and they want to take me to some of the outer islands. And the first place we go is to a pair of islands, Kwajalein and Ibai. Kwajalein is a US military installation. And when you get there, you have no sense that you're in the middle of the Pacific. There's golf courses and Baskin-Robbins and people walking around with their little strollers. It's like Stepford Wives meets The Truman Show, all right? Now, very short ferry ride from there, we get to Ibai. Ibai has very little vegetation. Most people are living in tin homes with, makeshift roofs, and the TB rate is 26 times that of the United States. The nickname is that it's the ghetto of the Pacific. And people who did live on Kwajalein were pushed out and moved to Ibai. And now the Marshallese who want to go to Kwajalein, they need a special pass, a work permit. And so I'm 15 and I'm taking this in, and one of the things that occurs to me is that these aren't parallel realities. To create this seeming utopia on Kwajalein, it requires a dystopia. And so there's a relationship between these two ways of world building. I'm in my 20s now in graduate school in the Bay Area, studying sociology at Berkeley, and I'm looking for a research project where I can think through some of these questions around science and technology. I have 2 small kids, so I can't do something exotic and go away somewhere far, so I need to study something right under my nose. And at the time, just so happens that the state of California was in the middle of passing proposing a bill that would invest millions of dollars into stem cell research because the federal government had cut off funding because of embryonic research. So proponents of the field, created this ballot measure that would create a new state agency, invest actually $3 billion into this field, create a new right to research in California for this particular field. And so this is Prop 71. Californians go to the ballot 2004, deciding whether to vote for Prop 71. On the very same ballot is Prop 72. Now, Prop 72, less well known, would have extended health care to the vast majority of Californians through their workplaces. And so what did we do? We voted up Prop 71, the future of medicine. We voted down Prop 72, health care for all, right here, right now. I remember a headline in one of the journalists writing about this. She said, imagine cardiac cells beating in a petri dish. Why? Because one of the goals of the field is so that we can, rather than needing a donor, if we need an organ transplant, we can sort of reverse engineer our own cells and grow organs that we need so our body won't reject it. Imagine growing cardiac cells beating in a petri dish. But we can't imagine extending empathy to other human beings in our everyday lives and having that reflected in our policies and our practices. So again, a lopsided imagination here at the level of state policy. Fast forward now, let's go to last fall, where I'm back in Atlanta. As I said, this is where I went to undergrad at Spelman. And one of the new nicknames of Atlanta is Techlanta, or Silicon Peach, because it's one of the fastest growing tech hubs in the country. It's also the city with the highest income inequality in the nation. Again, not unrelated, because where we've had tech booms, people who've lived in those places for generations are displaced and discarded, higher rents, growing costs, et cetera. How do we manage that inequality? Well, for the most part, we turn to investing more in policing to manage inequality. And so what the city is doing is it's investing in a $60 million, or rather $90 million facility called Cop City, what activists call Cop City, a training ground that essentially it invests more and more in militarizing law enforcement, trains officers from all over the country. To build this facility, they have to cut down Weelaunee Forest, which is one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta. Protects against heat waves and floods, located next to a predominantly working class Black community. In the process, we've witnessed over the last few years a historic mobilization of residents from all walks of life. ATLians pushing back against the militarizing imagination of city officials and corporations that are helping to fund Cop City. And one of my friends who's been involved in the organizing, she sent me about last year this time a photo that's really striking. She was at City Hall, the parents were, testifying, and so they created a little play area for the kids, a kids zone. And one of the children drew a picture. And the question that the child, the 10-year-old, wrote on this picture is, what did cops do to deserve a playground? Because their own school had been shuttered in the shadow of Cop City. Divergent thinking at its best. From college students to clergy, environmental activists to indigenous leaders, these forest defenders are inviting us into an alternate imagination of the future, where our social and our ecological well-being are interconnected, where true safety comes from connection, not more cops, but not without a price. Back in November, 61 Cop City protesters were arraigned on bogus racketeering and domestic terrorism charges, most facing between 5 and 20 years in prison for nonviolent protest, to silence the movement, setting a vile and dangerous precedent. Earlier this year, Georgia's Senate passed a bill criminalizing state bail funds for protest groups and making it illegal for charitable organizations to bail out more than 3 people a year. Soon after that, the state passed a law allowing police to arrest anyone they suspect of being an undocumented immigrant, reminding us it's not that more police are needed to deal with crime. Rather, more and more and more people are being criminalized to justify the need for police. So the struggle continues. Like Atlanta's forest defenders and like young people around the country on our campuses these last few weeks, we have to be bold when it comes to our social vision. But how? The first step is to stop policing the borders of our own imaginations. A world without prisons? Ridiculous. Schools that foster the genius of every child? Naive. Work that doesn't drive us into the grave? Impossible. A society where everyone has food, shelter, love, in your dreams. Exactly. Thank you.
Powerful. In this book, you discuss dreaming as a social practice. What do you mean by that? And what's the role of sleep and play in imagination and dreaming?
Yes, thank you. So in some ways, I'm being very literal when it comes to rest and dreaming, like thinking about the role of that in our lives, how we need to push back against the idea that we have to earn downtime or earn rest, as if it's not a fundamental need that we have to turn things off, to daydream, to check out. It's not being lazy. It's not being productive, thinking about where those logics come from in the first place. And then also the more sort of, a broader idea of dreaming. I have a dream, right? The ability, again, to not just react to things right in front of us, but to envision, to prefigure the world that we want. And so it's working in both ways, depending on where in the conversation we are, to really think about sort of claiming our ability to do both, to take naps, right? There's a number of groups that I talk about in a previous book, like black power naps. And looking at the work of Tricia Hershey and others, you know, really thinking about pushing back against the kind of productivity, the capitalist logics of productivity all the time. And both are related. Like, if we can't check out and have downtime and daydream, we also can't really do that broader envisioning in terms of world building. And so these are related processes, I think, where both our body, our mind, and our spirit are connected. Those dualisms that one is pitted against the other don't serve us.
Indeed. In your opening exercise, you began to talk a little bit about the potential role of schools and systems of education in their ability to foster imagination. So if you don't mind, take us from Freedom Fridays to Kiara and Ahmed while juxtaposing the United States and Finland.
Yes. So I start the book with my own experience in elementary school, getting pulled out of school once a week for a, quote, gifted and talented program, which I didn't know what that was at the time. For me, it just felt like cutting school once a week. Like, we got to board a bus and go somewhere else and play, basically, make up songs and dances and do all kinds of fun things. So it just felt like a break. I didn't know why we were there. And this, again, was in South Carolina. And so just reflecting on the kind of stratification in our schools, that a small sliver of students get to experience this kind of abundant imagination, whereas the rest of us are standardized, or sitting still, or raising our hand, or walking in lines, and becoming little robots. And so thinking about what makes some people deserve, why do we think that undifferentiated learning serves anyone, right? And so it starts that way, and then I talk about some high-profile examples that I'm sure many of you have heard about, whether it's Kiara Wilmot, the Florida teenager who was expelled and criminalized for a science experiment that started a little fire in the lab, to Ahmed in Texas some years ago, who brought a clock that he'd made out of a pencil box, which they said they thought was a bomb. So again, thinking about which young people get to expand their imaginations and get to experiment, and how so often it's criminalized when it's, in this case, Muslim and Black youth. And so there's an invitation there for us to really reflect on the fact that it's not that all young people are being squashed, but it's really stratified in this way. And then I offer some examples that we can sort of learn from, both in the US and globally, of taking play seriously as a site of learning. Whether in Finland, where kids don't even start worrying about reading and math until they're like 7 or 8, because play is the focus. Like, the teachers are studying their play, watching them play, all the things you can learn about collaboration and communication and all those things. And so looking at that particular model, and what's interesting is when we have these kind of international tests that rank countries, the Finnish students, by the time they're 18 and they've had this focus on play, lots of recess time, et cetera, about no testing until you get to this point, they out-test everyone else who's so obsessed with these tests, right? So there's an inverse relationship between not caring about tests and being able to breeze through them. So there's examples like that, but then there's examples that are even kind of harder to reckon with, which is in highly policed communities. I draw upon the work of ethnographer Ariana Brazier, where she spent a couple years in Atlanta embedded in these schools and neighborhoods where highly disciplined and very little recess time, very strict. She found that the children figure out a way to play by any means necessary, even under these conditions. One of the examples, and she categorizes these as ghetto games, in a very loving way, this kind of by any means necessary. And the kids in one of the schools she was embedded in created an entire currency that only they had access to, right? And it wasn't just symbolic. They would actually trade goods and services with this money that they created, whether it was like getting a jump in line or extra snacks or what have you. And so here's an example where even though the adults in their lives are really, following this script that, excellence means rigidity and structure. They are finding ways to subvert that in myriad forms. And so again, we're drawing on the work of people who've been thinking and studying play and getting us to trouble our associations between, academic excellence and, this much more capacious understanding of how we flourish as human beings that can't be quantified and can't be tested.
Thank you. So, in many of your other books, you talk about the impact of technology and life and the social fabric and how we can create a new society. In this book, we tiptoe in there. I want you to talk about the role of technology and imagination and take us from Kevlar backpacks to robo-dogs and Brianna's Garden and Herna.
Yes, thank you for that. And so, this book is not strictly about technology. I've written that book already, so I wanted to shift gears a little, but I couldn't help myself, only because, as I hinted to in the opening, these tech-mediated futures are so dominant. They colonize our imagination about what we think the future is going to be, is sort of mediated through these. And so I felt like I had to give some space to that. And I had written, closer to the end of the project, a kind of rant against, these folks who are imagining a future in which human beings are superfluous, where we are sort of uploading our consciousness into the network, where there are billions of, of these beings that are not embodied, and just their worldview. So I had this rant, and I was like, oh, I need this to be, people might not finish the book, so I cut and paste very late in the editing process and put it towards the beginning. So I said, even if you don't finish the book, at least you'll read the rant. And really, it's, I have a lot of issues, but one of which is that the very people who are creating the kind of tech-mediated forms of harm and discrimination, whether it's, AI systems that are raining hell bombs on people, or whether it's everyday kinds of automated decision-making systems that are deciding who gets what opportunities in healthcare and education, et cetera. So the whole spectrum. The very individuals, companies, worldviews that are producing those problems are now positioning themselves as the solution. So it's like, okay, now that we're awakening to the problems, they're like, well, we can create a center for the future, an institute for the future. I'm like, just sit down. You've had your chance. We've seen what you've done, and so part of it is just the problem that I have with, again, turning to the same set of actors for now directing us out of this mess. Rather, let's invite a whole new set of perspectives, worldviews that have been squashed, deemed backwards. So rather than artificial intelligence, perhaps what we need is ancestral intelligence, a different kind of AI that is really broadening our imagination, that makes sure that no one is left behind. Because what you'll see in that rant is these same futurists that are pitching us this long-term worldview have a very eugenic understanding of which human beings matter. Because what they say is these pesky problems of pandemics and, violent policing and war, and these are just short-term problems that humanity faces. Oh, famine, that sexy eugenic, problem that you guys are worried about. We need to worry about the long term, not these little things. And in pitting it like this, what they're saying is that the people who are suffering through war and famine and public health crises and policing, you're disposable. We don't need to invest in that. And so part of it is to really see through the buzzwords, the good-sounding rhetoric, to actually see what are the logics, what are the imaginations, who's being valued in this vision of the future, so that one, we can push back in it, but not end there, so that we can collectively begin to craft a much more humane, loving, just, and joyful way of conceiving the world and building the kind of future that we want. And so technology figures in this only because it's really a site of imposition that and again, it's not against technology, because one of the examples you just mentioned, Brianna's Garden, is the AR, VR experience that is not about predicting risk and not about creating new forms of warfare, but it's about using technology to build community. It's a digital public space that you can download now from the App Store that is named after Breonna Taylor, who was killed by Louisville police in 2020. And her family, in collaboration with a group of technologists, have created this experience. There's both a virtual reality component and an augmented reality component that really gives space to grieving, but also healing and organizing. And so we can use technology differently, but it really matters who and what is behind the screen if we're going to take it down a different path. And so hopefully you get some examples throughout the book that open up that possibility that we can build on together.
And you walked right into the next question. How do we reckon with who and what currently monopolize the space to envision the future, hoard the ability to dream, and privatize the resources to make the imaginations materialize?
Yeah, there's so many fronts. There's so many places to begin. There's not only one path forward, and I try not to be too prescriptive and say, like, this is the 10-point plan for us. Because one way to think about it is, as many ways as the problems that we're up against are produced, those are all openings. Those are all ways that we can get involved and begin to do things differently. I think, as you know, one starting point for me that I think is important is really to question at a fundamental level what forms of knowledge we need to craft these alternative futures, right? Because there's a hierarchy of knowledge. We see it very clearly in academia, but I'm sure you all perceive it in terms of, yes, we have different disciplines, but some are valued more than others, right? So even when you have a space where you have different people around a table, we know whose word really trumps others, right? And it goes along very predictable lines. We have language for it, the hard sciences versus the soft sciences. Or even when we have public conversations and people start talking about, oh, the public needs more scientific literacy. That automatically tells you something. And what I want to suggest is the technologists, the scientists, need some social literacy and some historical literacy. So this is a way of really thinking about what knowledge is fundamental. And so when we talk about AI in particular, there's one of these phrases that's used to describe a methodology, deep learning, right? To talk about the depth, the computational depth that alerts us to the supposed sophistication of these systems. And so again, when it comes to deep learning, I want to say that computational depth without social and historical depth is actually superficial learning. It's not that deep. And is reason why we're having so many of the issues that we have, because the people who are creating tools for society to use have no clue about what actually composes society, right? What are the fault lines, hidden and obvious? What are the histories that have gotten us to this point to help us make sense of? And now you're creating some tool that's supposed to help better healthcare, better education, and know nothing about education or healthcare or any of the rest. And so again, at a fundamental level, we have to reclaim our power and the forms of situated knowledge, experiential knowledge that are necessary to create these. I'll give you one example of many. So there's a team that actually did their homework, a group of researchers who, as they do their homework, that is, they studied, they thought about, okay, well, how are these health disparities produced before we start trying to create some AI that can predict, in this particular research, predict patients' pain based on x-rays, all right? And so what they realized was if they relied on doctors' reports of pain and use that as the training for these AI systems, that would produce the same omissions, forms of discrimination that we see in the analog version, from medical students on up, that routinely underdiagnose Black pain. And so they said, if we train AI based on that expert knowledge, it's going to, as it becomes supposedly more intelligent, it's going to be more racist. So they said, why don't we train the AI based on patients' own self-reports of pain? And not only was it more accurate, it was less biased. So this is a group, again, Obermeyer and colleagues, who are not just narrowly looking at how to create a good technology, but are thinking about the history, sociality of healthcare disparities, and building those insights into the process and getting better results both at a technical level and a social level. So it is possible. But again, and the last thing I'll say is, it has to start in our educational system. It has to start much earlier, even before I get them. You know, I'm teaching young people, I teach a class, I think this is the first class, cross-listed engineering and African American studies at Princeton, getting students from all across the university, again, to cross-pollinate, to think about, we have to learn from each other in a much more equitable setting where the STEM students don't feel like they are the big dogs and know more than the humanities and social science students. But it has to come much earlier. You know, we went through this whole phase where everyone was sending their kids to coding camps, you know, coding, and not learning how to critically question these codes and these phenomena, right? And so even at that level of young people who are learning how to work with the technology, we have to build their capacity for critical thinking, but also creative thinking. Criticality and creativity have to go hand in hand, where you can recognize the problems, but also say, how can we do this differently? How can we create something differently? And fortunately, through the lab that, you know, I helped found, and many other examples of organizations that I could list. If you go to the resources tab of my website, both throughout the US and around the world, this capacity to be both critical and creative is growing and part of a larger tech justice movement. So there's so many ways we can get involved and try to stretch, you know, our collective approach to these issues.
During the pandemic, when everyone else was baking banana bread, you purchased an apiary. And for those of you who have not read the book, you're going to really enjoy this portion of it. But the bees taught you so many different lessons. So if you don't mind, share with us a few of the lessons that the bees can teach us about interdependence with regard to the present and the future.
Yeah, so I'm become a bee nerd. Have a bee Instagram if you want to follow me, bee.earthseed, where I put all the lessons that I'm learning through bees. And where to start? There's so many ways that we can use these bees as a mirror onto our own sort of ways of organizing, working, valuing. But I think I'll just stick with one particular insight that hit me last summer. When we were out there in the yard, and I was realizing, you know, I kind of knew intellectually, but it just occurred to me as I saw how hard they were working to fill the hives with honey, that the bees that were working over the summer to do all this, you know, to make sure there was sustenance and sweetness, and, you know, those bees would not live that long. They were not going to live through the winter, right? So they were doing all of this work for the next generation of bees. They weren't going to directly benefit, right? And so again, it's thinking about, what do we owe future generations, that we might not see the fruit or taste the sweetness of what we're putting all of our effort and work into, right? But thinking about the bees and their willingness to actually like pass the baton, this sweetness, this sustenance is for the next generation. They're not going to live to see it, is a lesson for us in thinking about how we want to use our little short time on this earth and what we owe. You know, indigenous communities think in terms of 7 generations. What do we owe? 7 generations. And so part of it is to, again, learn from the bees, and even though it sounds corny, be visionary.
All right, we're going to move on to our Q&A portion of our event. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Keep all questions and comments brief. We will start on that side.
Hello, I'm a big fan, so groupie here. I wanted to ask you just, how do you stay the course? I think for many of us right now, both when you see what's going on internationally, nationally, and in our own workspaces, sometimes it's like, so, I mean, we will just be like in our house, like crawling, like scared and afraid. And I know there is this calling to dream, and I really like, I think what has been helpful to me already, and I want to thank you for that, is your two questions, what if? And then, but why not now, right? And trying to start manifesting the future now. So how do we stay the course?
Yeah, I love that question because it's a question we have to answer for ourselves every day, really. There are many things that I draw on, many resources, depending on what the circumstances are. You know, we talk about imagination, it's not just the future, but it's our historical imagination that can actually be a resource. And I say that in terms of reminding ourselves how many times people have looked around and thought, this is impossible to change, right? The height of chattel slavery, you know, the height of Jim Crow, the height of colonialism. And yet people decided, you know what, we're gonna look beyond that horizon and we're going to do the work. We might, again, not live to see the end of these brutal systems, but we have to do our part and pass on that energy to the next generation to continue. So for me, a really keen historical imagination is vital to think, okay, at what point, you know, like imagining, you know, ancestors who their parents had been enslaved, their grandparents had been enslaved, their nothing in their entire memory or line could tell them that this system would ever end. This was all they and everyone they knew ever knew. And yet, waking up with that fire, that abolitionist fire, to think, no, but this is not right. I don't care if it seems unrealistic. I don't care if it seems impossible. I'm gonna subvert. I'm going to poison these crops. I'm gonna set fire to this. I'm gonna run away. I'm gonna do small and large acts of defiance as part of bringing down this brutality. And so for me, that kind of historical imagination is really a daily reminder. I have a sign in a little thing framed in my office by one of my favorite writers, Octavia E. Butler. And, you know, it says, to paraphrase, we can each of us do the impossible if we can convince ourselves it's been done before. And so again, we have to think about the fact that we're not doing something new, we're building on a tradition. When you understand yourselves as part of a tradition, it emboldens you. It doesn't feel as risky. There are still risks involved. Like right now, I'm currently being investigated by my university for my support of students. And so there are risks involved. But if you're part of a tradition, that's not gonna stop you. That's not gonna stop you. So I think that's part of it, both in terms of what we might think of more virtual community, ancestral, but also real people who have your back here and now. Like thinking about who you're working with, who are you standing arm in arm with. You know, so many of the courageous acts that we bear witness to are made possible because people know that they're not alone, you know? And so we have to think about that. That could look different ways. I mean, in one way is, you know, we see the kind of protests, but also more quiet forms of refusal and world building that don't make the headlines, that don't get a hashtag, but still require this kind of collective action and community. So for me, that's a huge part of it. And then also going back to rest and dreaming is just also like, you know, I posted this series a few weeks ago, you know, of a lot of the, you know, sort of freedom fighters that we know their work, but we don't know how they played. We don't know how they rested. So I posted photos of like Malcolm X with his camera and Rosa Parks doing yoga and Audre Lorde sunbathing and Nina Simone dancing on the beach, and to remind us that's all part of it. That's not separate, that's not something we have to be shameful of, right? That we are full human beings. We are not just the things that we're fighting for, right? And so again, historical memory, it's important like to put those images in front of us to remind us, yeah, let's go enjoy the sun today, you know? Let's go to the beach, let's enjoy poetry, let's have hobbies, you know, let's take naps. And so again, part of that is because this is for the long haul. Otherwise, we burn out, right? And so we have to pace ourselves and build that kind of play and rest into everything that we do. Yeah.
We'll take a question from this side here on the left.
I totally understand and agree with what you're saying. My question is, I live in a very comfortable community. People in my community are not oppressed, do not have that history. And I find it harder to challenge them, to light the fire of creativity under someone who says, this is working for me.
I appreciate that. And I think many people can relate to that. It's a different kind of problem that you're up against. And, you know, again, not to be prescriptive, but just to offer a way to think about that problem. You know, I often say, you know, people who think that they're privileged or people who think that they're X, Y, and Z. Because at one level, there's certainly a level of comfort and privilege that is obvious. But in other ways, they are also being affected by the inhumanity of the world that we live in, where their own humanity is actually at stake. So one thing to note is that when we're thinking about these struggles and we're thinking about this process of social change, this is not charity work that some people need to do on behalf of others. So part of it is to shift our own thinking about philanthropy and charity, where like the haves are helping the have-nots, from a charity framework to a solidarity framework, where you understand that your well-being is intimately bound up with mine. That's a different way of thinking about why and how you go about getting involved. And one of the things that, as part of that shift that's helpful, you know, just in terms of research and a keener insight, is that when we do studies state by state and country by country, we find that in places with greater inequality, the haves, so-called haves, in those places, they're not doing as well as the haves in more equitable contexts, both at the level of public health, at the level of emotional and mental well-being. Because if you think about it, these levels of inequality are not natural. They've been engineered, produced, like I talked about Kwajalein and Ibai, right? And so part of it is to understand, again, that if your well-being is intimately bound up with mine, what does it take to sustain these levels of inequality? When I was in high school, again, I went to high school in Swaziland. It was called Swaziland at the time, Eswatini. And first thing I realized when I got like off the plane and started going around was that the small elite in the country, they lived in fortresses. They lived high walls, barbed wire, guards at the, you know, gate. So fortresses, but also essentially they had to put themselves in prison to maintain that monopoly on resources and wealth. So what does that do over time to people when they're always having to look over their shoulder, when they're always worried someone's coming to get what they got? Levels of stress, levels of anxiety. And so some colleagues of mine at Princeton that wrote a book called Deaths of Despair on white Americans, who the first generation of which are not living as long as the prior generation, dying by suicide and substance abuse, et cetera. Suicide, substance abuse, and other issues. And so part of it is to see it like it comes back around. You can't sustain this level of stress. Another colleague, Dying of Whiteness, Jonathan Metzl, has written a fantastic book where he does 3 case studies to show how white Americans in these different states, they, one, were not supporting investment in social policies because, and they would state explicitly in the interviews, because they didn't want black people to benefit. No funding in education, no funding in healthcare, because the undeserving would also have access to it. And these are people who were suffering because they didn't have access to it. There's one guy that he interviews that's literally on his deathbed with like plugged into machines who's cursing Obamacare, even though he needs the very thing that he is against because it's seen as whatever. And so again, this is a kind of pathology where you hate someone so much that you're willing to suffer as a result. And so part of it is that shift from charity to solidarity is to understand that you are doing this for you, not for other people. It's because if we're interconnected, then some people's suffering, it'll find a way to get into your own body, your own bloodstream, your own psyche, because it's not natural. If we're truly one human family and our policies and our society doesn't reflect that back at us, that's something very wrong, that we're all going to internalize. That is, inequality makes all of us sick in different ways. And so I think that's a fundamental shift that if we can propagate and diffuse in the same way that these very distorted ideas have been diffused. So the fact that in 2024 that we're still talking about, racism, class oppression, sexism, is because those who have diffused these ideas have been so effective at naturalizing these hierarchies and these distinctions, using, in many cases, science to say these are facts of nature. This is not just prejudicial judgments, these are facts of nature. So that's my way of also just saying, for those who are scholars and academics, is that these seemingly political issues, actually academia and sites of learning have been fundamental, they've been architects in creating this. So it's our responsibility to also dismantle these erroneous structures and help to build something new. It's not something that happens outside of higher education and learning, because our disciplines have been fundamental to creating these harms. So we have to deal with it ourselves.
That is unfortunately all the time we have. Can we get a big round of applause for our moderator and presenter today?